Good day. The last 24 hours, the single most important event in the Ukraine conflict did not take place in the conflict area in Ukraine. It took place in Ramstein in Germany, where the Ramstein group of countries met with the Ukrainians themselves. The US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, was present, and they all together discussed further aid packages for Ukraine. And by general consensus, these were the weakest aid packages that the Western powers have provided up to this time. The Germans committed to provide 77 more Leopard 1 tanks, as I discussed yesterday. These Leopard 1 tanks are supplied to Ukraine. They appear on the battlefronts. They don't seem to be taken particularly seriously, as far as I can see, by the Russians. They barely talk about them. The Russians report destruction of Leopard tanks. They don't make any distinction between Leopard 1s and Leopard 2s. I suspect that pretty much the only tanks, Leopard tanks, that are operating in Ukraine at the moment are the Leopard 1s. They are seriously outgunned by the Russian tanks. Their armor is much lighter. And anyway, one way or the other, they are obviously better than nothing, the Ukrainians would say, but they're not going to make any decisive difference. Several commentators noticed that the total commitments made by the Western powers in terms of funding for arms and other things to Ukraine seem to be significantly less than before. There didn't seem to be any great commitment of air defense systems, which is interesting, given the priority that the Western powers have recently given to air defense and the extent to which air defense has played an essential role in trying to shield Ukraine from Russian missile attacks and, of course, FAB bomb attacks. And, well, beyond that, and on top of that, there was apparently a discussion at Ramstein of the Ukrainian request to launch long-range missile strikes against Russia. The British and the French supposedly advocated on Ukraine's behalf on this issue, but the United States again said no. Lloyd Austin said no. He was interviewed after the meeting. Many have pointed out the hesitant and evasive answers that he gave, but ultimately it was clear, listening to him, that the American position continues to be that they do not support and they will not agree to long-range missile strikes by the Ukrainians against the Russians. Now, Simplicius the thinker has a long piece on Substack today, and he suggests that there is actually an agreement between the Americans and the Russians that the Americans do not authorize long-range missile strikes by the Ukrainians against Russia, and that in return the Russians have made unspecified or unknown promises not to carry out their own attacks, presumably against American military positions in various places around the world. That may very well be true, by the way. The American and Russian militaries have been in constant contact throughout the entire conflict. The American diplomats and the Russian diplomats scarcely ever speak to each other anymore. In the case of European diplomats and Russian diplomats, any contact that takes place is completely under the radar. I have no knowledge of it. It never gets reported in the media whatsoever. And certainly we don't have any reports for some time, at least since the Austrian Chancellor went to Russia, which is, I think, more than a year ago now, on a brief visit, which led to nothing. Anyway, there's been no contact between the Russians and the Europeans at a political level. Of course, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, went to Moscow and then to Beijing and then to the United States on what was clearly a peace and negotiating mission. But it's absolutely clear, the European Union has made it absolutely clear that he doesn't speak for the West. But despite the absence of diplomatic and political contacts, the military contacts have continued. They've not been very common, but every so often, the chair of the American chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff will speak to the Russian chief of the General Staff. Obviously, that has always been Gerasimov throughout the crisis. In the case of the United States, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is now General Brown. And we've also had conversations between the Russian defense ministers, Shoigu and Belousov, and the American Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. So it is possible that at some point over the course of these discussions, which have taken place throughout the entire period of the conflict, an informal agreement was reached in which the Russians set out what their red lines were, their actual red lines, not the fictitious red lines that various people in the media in the West have invented, and that the Russians made it clear that missile strikes and such things on the territory of what one might call old Russia, pre-2014 Russia, was absolutely out of the question, and that the Americans agreed to that, and that the Russians then also said that they would take reciprocal restraining action of their own, presumably denying that kind of missile technology to their various allies. I mean, that is a reasonable guess. Having said that, it may be that there is no such agreement, even an informal agreement, but the Russians have made it very clear over the last few months that the launching of missiles against their territory, against pre-2014 Russian territory, would indeed be a red line. The president of Russia, President Putin, has explained at extraordinary length that the use of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles could only take place with the direct involvement of US and British technicians, and that as far as the Russians are concerned, if missile strikes using these weapons are used against Russia, then American and British troops are involved in conducting missile strikes against Russia, and that is, of course, an act of war. And though the Russians are not talking about war, about launching World War III, they've made it very clear in various diplomatic démarches. They called in the British ambassador one point after the ATACMS explosion over a beach in Crimea, near Sevastopol. They called in the American ambassador. Anyway, they've made it very clear, both in public and in private and in direct communications to both Britain and the United States, that as far as they are concerned, the use of Western long-range missiles in that kind of way, carrying out deep strikes against Russia, is a red line, and that the Russians will react, and will react strongly if it ever happens. So, Lloyd Austin will not want to acknowledge that, not in public. He will not want to say that there is an informal agreement between the Russians and the Americans on this issue. there would be outrage from all the usual suspects, Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton, and all kinds of commentators in the media, if the existence of such an agreement were acknowledged. And besides, it's very difficult for the United States to admit publicly, to acknowledge publicly, that they are adhering to a Russian red line, even in the absence of such an agreement. Because again, if Lloyd Austin were to come out and say that there is a Russian red line which we cannot cross, the same people, Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, all the others, would again be outraged and would say that this is unacceptable. And since when has the United States ever accepted the red lines of other countries? So Lloyd Austin can't admit that, so he's being more careful. He hesitated before answering, but he did provide an answer. And by the way, we shouldn't dismiss what he said. He said that Russian aircraft, the ones that carry the long-range bombs, their bases are out of range of American missiles. A fact, by the way, which to my mind confirms that the air-launched missiles, I've been informed that I'm not pronouncing the name of these missiles correctly, but I'm going to still call them JSAMs. We all know what I'm referring to. Anyway, it confirms to me, Lloyd Austin's words confirm to me that there is no intention so far by the United States to provide the very long-range version of these missiles to Ukraine. Anyway, he said that the Russian aircraft are outside the range of the missiles that the United States have supplied. He said something which is true, that the Ukrainians have their various drone capabilities and are able to attack these bases anyway. But of course, nobody takes that seriously. The damage that Ukrainian drones are able to do on Russian bases can sometimes, occasionally be considerable, but it has been diminishing as the Russians have gradually hardened their bases to deal with Ukrainian drone attacks. Certainly, missiles, American missiles, could do a lot more damage if they were to get through. So he said that the Ukrainians can carry out drone attacks, but ultimately, and he did say this, authorizing the use of these missiles is not going to change the direction of the war. It cannot alter what is going on the battlefields. And I think that this is obviously true. Now, let me again address this topic in purely cold-blooded military terms. To repeat again, the Russians have launched 10,000 cruise missiles against Ukraine. They have caused massive devastation across Ukraine, but they've not prevented the Ukrainian army from still fighting. A couple of hundred missiles, and that's the most that the United States can afford to supply to Ukraine, cannot do anything like the same number of damage to Russia, the biggest country on earth, as, by the way, Lloyd Austin also pointed out. He mentioned that it was a very big country. It cannot possibly inflict, the American missiles cannot possibly inflict the same level of damage upon Russia that the Russian missiles are inflicting on Ukraine, not remotely. That's not even allowing for the fact that we're talking also against an operating and functional Russian air defense system, which the American missiles would have to penetrate. So All that would happen is that we would see American missiles, which are in relatively short supply, another point which Lloyd Austin made, be launched against Russian targets, some of which are out of range, some of which might be still in range, against an air defense system that would probably be able successfully to counter most of them, and which, even if all of the missiles got through, which is inconceivable, by the way, well, the damage would not be such as would make any effective difference to the war. All that would happen is that a Russian red line would be breached, the Russians would be furious, they would take countermeasures, and the United States would have gained nothing as a result of this, and nor would Ukraine, except that America's limited missile stocks of long-range missiles, which are difficult to produce and expensive to produce, would have been depleted for no useful purpose. Now, saying all of this, I should quickly say that I've had a rather interesting and very helpful email from a member of the Duran community who's got a military background in the United States, as I understand. Anyway, he has corrected my numbers about the JSAM stockpile. He says it's significantly bigger than I thought it was, but he also acknowledges that the United States is most unlikely to give Ukraine more than a few hundred of these missiles, and that's, I suspect, still being optimistic, because these missiles are an essential part of the American Air Force's system, that they need these missiles in order to have their Air Force functional. They cannot afford to provide missiles of this kind to the Ukrainians, given the burn rate at which the Ukrainians run through missiles, because the United States needs these missiles for itself. But he did make some other interesting points. Firstly, he said that it's true that these missiles fly at medium-level altitudes for most of their the distance that they cover to a target. They do, however, apparently go close to the ground, closer to when they reach their target. That doesn't surprise me, by the way. Russian Kalibr missiles, which make no pretense to be stealth missiles, to my knowledge, do the same thing. So, well, anyway, there we go. So they do go closer to the ground. Unlike me, this person believes that the fact that these are stealthy missiles would make it all but impossible for the Russians to shoot them down. Though he did say that the missiles use GPS guidance, which, by the way, is confirmed by many sources. And given Russian success in jamming GPS signals, he thinks that this is a point of vulnerability for these missiles, which the Russians would be able to exploit. I think that the Russians will be able to jam the GPS signals, as they've jammed signals of HIMARS missiles and all kinds of other systems, Excalibur shells and all of that. And I also think, by the way, unlike him, that the Russians will be able to shoot down these missiles. They'll be able to track them with their radars. I'm certain of that. And they will be able to shoot them down. These missiles were developed in an earlier technological period, even though they're of relatively recent production. I think by now that radar technology has evolved to the point where the Russians can track these kind of missiles. Now, for the record, there are stories that the Russians have already acquired two of these missiles, largely intact, following an American missile strike on positions in Syria which use these missiles, I believe, in 2019. This story has never been confirmed and never will be. And for the record, I am deeply skeptical about it. I question whether this is true. But I do recall that some months ago, the Russians used a missile called the KH-69, which is similar in some respects at least, or appears to be similar in some respects to the JSAMs, in that it too apparently is a stealthy subsonic missile. If you look at photos of it, pictures of it, of which we have quite a few, by the way, it bears a certain resemblance, physical resemblance to the JSAMs. I say that I'm not a person who's able to spot differences between missiles. Understanding photos of these things is not at all easy for me. So, don't rely on my views about this. But anyway, suffice to say that to me, they do look sort of similar. That doesn't mean that the one is based on the other, or that the Russians have reversed it, engineered the American missile, or anything like that. But anyway, the Russians also have a missile that has or claims to have something of the same sort of stealth capabilities. And the fact that they have such a missile suggests to me that they have some understanding of the technology of these sort of missiles. Perhaps they're not as sophisticated in their stealth capabilities as the American ones. Who knows? But I would be very surprised if, in light of that, the Russians haven't themselves developed countermeasures against these sort of missiles. And to repeat again, they do have the ability to jam GPS signals. This has been shown on many occasions over the course of this conflict. So anyway, suffice to say, I think that the United States has correctly concluded that what the Ukrainians are demanding in pure military terms doesn't make any sense. It crosses a Russian red line. It won't change the course of the war. It will result in Russian reactions, countermeasures against the United States in various places, which could be very disadvantageous to the United States. And for that reason, the Americans, for the moment, are putting their foot down and are saying no. And I think that is very much the mood in the Pentagon at the moment. Now, this being the Ukraine war, given the kind of lobbying we're likely to see from some people in the media, I've been reading articles from people in the national interest and such places fiercely advocating for Ukraine to be authorized to use these sort of weapons. It's impossible to say that at some point, as Ukraine's position continues to deteriorate, that the pressure to authorize the use of these weapons, long-range weapons, allowing long-range missile strikes against Russia, that authorization might not come. But for the moment, at least, the United States continues to hold the line on this. And by the way, and it makes sense. Right, anyway, there we are. That's the situation with these missiles. Now, before I finish on this topic, there is one thing I do want to say, because I have been reading many of the articles and commentaries that various people who advocate granting Ukraine permission to use these missiles against Russia I've been reading many of the articles that they've been writing, and I notice that one of the things that they repeatedly say is that if Ukraine is granted the right to use these missiles against positions deep inside Russian territory, we don't need to worry because the Russian threats of countermeasures are all bluff, because the Russians are not going to risk World War III over something like this. They, in other words, go from a position where the Russians are threatening countermeasures to a position where the Russians are supposed to be threatening World War III. But the Russians are not threatening World War III, and they have never threatened World War III. What they have repeatedly said is that if the Western powers engage in long-range missile strikes on Russian territory, then the Russians will take measures of their own. They might launch missile strikes, specifically against Britain, on British missile facilities, including potentially in Britain itself. They have said that, but mostly what they would do is assist third parties by providing them with the technology that would enable them to conduct missile strikes, very powerful missile strikes, against British and American and French and other Western military assets around the world. And of course, the United States especially has many, many military assets around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Far East, in all sorts of places. And it would be impossible to defend all of them against the potential of missile strikes of this kind. It seems that the Russians were close, came very close, for example, to providing missile technology, advanced missile technology, to the Houthis in Yemen just a few months ago. And the United States and Saudi Arabia lobbied the Russians not to do this. This is the reports. And the Russians eventually agreed. Now, maybe if there was an informal agreement between the Russians and the Americans that these missiles, long-range missiles, would not be used against their territory, maybe it was in the context of those discussions over Russian missile supplies to the Houthis that the Americans gave their agreement, gave the Russians their promise that long-range missile strikes on Russian territory would not take place. Just saying. But anyway, that's the threat. Now, of course, this would still be a massively dangerous situation if American ships, warships, or American bases are attacked by sophisticated missiles using technology provided by Russia. There will be inevitably demands for escalation from the usual suspects in the United States, retaliation against Russia itself. We could very easily find ourselves in a situation where the whole conflict, if you like, between the US and Russia starts to escalate out of control. But when advocates of this extremely bad idea of long-range missile strikes on Ukraine come along and say that the Russians won't adhere to their red lines, that what they say is a bluff, that they're unlikely to, that they're not going to start World War III over something like this, we should understand that they are not arguing against what the Russians are really warning, actually warning that they will do. They are engaging, in effect, in what are known as straw man arguments. Arguments that the Russians are talking about World War III, which for the moment at least they are not. Anyway, let's move on now and discuss the situation on the battlefronts. Before doing so, I would, however, say that I think that the Ukrainians are going to be very disappointed by the outcome of this meeting in Ramstein, and the Russians certainly think so. We've had some comments about this, for example, from Group of Forces North. They say that, this is from Group of Forces North, today's meeting in Ramstein, in the Ramstein format, did not give Kiev what it expected. The agreed package of military aid may help the defense of the Ukrainian armed forces, but it certainly cannot be called a turning point. Yes, the Ukrainian army will receive some armored vehicles and missiles for HIMARS, which we'll soon have nowhere to load. This is because so many HIMARS launchers are now being destroyed by the Russians. We will come to that shortly. But then Group of Forces North goes on to say Kiev did not receive the most important thing, air defense, which means that Russian missiles will continue to destroy enemy targets in its rear with high efficiency. And that is a comment, by the way, from Group of Forces North, which, let's not forget, is a part of the Russian military. So the Ukrainians are going to be disappointed with the results of the Ramstein meeting. They're going to be very unnerved, I suspect, by the demands from the IMF for cuts in spending, higher taxes, less support for the Ukrainian currency, VAT increases, and further privatizations. I think the Ukrainians will not like that at all. I suspect that cumulatively now, the Ukrainians are feeling under increasing pressure. They sense that things on the battlefronts are not going well. In fact, there's no doubt about that. But I think that they're also probably feeling that support from them, from the Western powers, is beginning to fall away. The West has exhausted its ability to keep supporting Ukraine. Even when the will is there, the means are not, something which advocates of unlimited support for Ukraine in the West never seem able to understand. Anyway, let's now move to the actual situation on the battlefronts. And the first thing to say is that Syrski's comment that the Russians have run out of steam in the Pokrovsk area has been ridiculed by a company commander, Mykola Melnik, of the 47th Brigade, which is now back redeployed in the Pokrovsk area. He's reported as saying, yesterday, Glavkom and Verkhovny, that means to say the Supreme Commander, in other words, Syrsky, reported that there is a stabilization in the Pokrovsk direction. But if it is a stabilization, then I am a ballerina. The Russians continue to advance. As I mentioned, the Russians do not have enough strength to simultaneously attack Pokrovsk, Selidovo, and Kurakhivka, so they have chosen one priority and are breaking through our defenses. Among the priority targets, the Russians have Ukrainsk and Girnik, then Kurakhivka. Everything is quite logical because it will allow them to surround our group of forces holding the defense between the Nevelsk and Volcha River. You don't need to be a general to understand the main plan of the enemy, just as you understand that the Russians did not destroy the bridges over the Volcha River, only because, due to their advantage in drones, they organized a hunt for our ambulances and equipment there. The time to withdraw our brigades without major losses has now been lost. Now the Avdiivka scenario will most likely occur when the retreat was controlled, and he puts the words in quotation marks, in other words he's being ironic, only in the reports of the commanders. But, and then he ends up optimistically, remember, however difficult the situation, eventually we will win. And anyway, that's what one Ukrainian officer who's actually battling on the front lines is saying. Now, we've had some information over the last couple of hours from the situation in Pokrovsk, and the first is something that came from Radovka yesterday. Last night, they reported that the Russians have pulled their forces back in southern Selidovo and have consolidated again in the village of Mikhailovka. The Russians have made a decision that the fight for Ukrainsk must take a priority over Selidovo. Selidovo is a much bigger place. It would be difficult to capture, given that the Ukrainians have sent many reinforcements there. It makes more sense for the Russians to focus on Ukrainsk. And if, of course, the Russians capture Ukrainsk and then press on and capture the village of Tsukurinye to the west, well, the Ukrainian position in Selidovo becomes undefendable anyway. So let's focus instead, as Radovka would no doubt say, on Ukrainsk. And here the Russians are reporting significant progress. They're claiming that they have advanced into Ukrainsk from the southeast and from the north, and they also claim that they fully control the village of Lisivka immediately to the east, and they also claim to control the village of Zelanye Pershe that we have been talking about so much recently, though so far they do not appear to have advanced further towards the other village of Zelanye Drucha. So anyway, a battle for Ukrainsk is underway. There's a sense that an awful lot of other battles are taking place in the Pokrovsk area as well. And this morning, we had the following report from the Russian news agency TASS. And it says this: Russian forces have evened out the front line in the Donetsk People's Republic and expanded the foothold for an offensive near the Ukrainian army's key hubs in the Donetsk area over the past week, security forces told TASS. Which security forces? Who are these people? Sounds like intelligence, Russian intelligence. Over the week, our forces liberated several residential areas in the region. Some of them are of crucial strategic importance. Could that refer to Zelanye Pershe? Which allowed us to straighten out the front line and expand the bridgehead. Later, a wide front offensive on key enemy hubs will follow. This will involve offensives on Ugledar, Krasnoarmeysk, called Pokrovsk in Ukraine, and Dmitrov, called Mirnograd in Ukraine. Now that appears to come from official Russian sources, and it has been conveyed to the official Russian news agency, which is TASS. In other words, the Russians are capturing the villages, the settlements, the coal mines, the slag heaps. They're shaping the battlefield, as I believe the Americans like to say, in advance of a major offensive to capture the three main hubs that the Ukrainians have, which are defined as Ugledar, Pokrovsk, and Mirnograd. To those, one must add Kurakovo, which is located between Vuhledar in the south and these other places. Now, if we turn first to the situation around Kurakovo, there are reports that as well as entering Ukrainsk, and that the Russians have sent reconnaissance groups sniffing around the town of Girnik further south. As I understand it, it's not suggested that they have actually entered Girnik yet, but as I've also discussed, if you look at a map, if Girnik is captured, then the next village south of Girnik is Kurakhivka. The village of Zelanye Druha lies also immediately to the north of two other villages, Zoryani and Kurakhivka itself. If the Russians capture all of these places, then they will indeed have straightened the front lines and they will be able to attack Kurakhivka, and then if they capture Kurakhivka, they have reached the Kurakhovo reservoir, and of course Kurakhovo lies immediately to the south of the reservoir. But the Russians are also south of the reservoir because over the last few hours there are reports that the Russians have now finally cleared the entirety of Krasnogorovka. Perhaps that is the other residential area that these security forces are talking about in their discussions with TASS. Now, when I say that they've cleared Krasnogorovka, the reports say that the Russians have, there is film, there are actual pictures which show Russian troops in one of the two streets leading west from Krasnogorovka, occupying positions. A building on one of these two streets, the northern street, halfway along this street, and apparently they also control some of the fields to the north of these streets. These are the fields where those Ukrainian battalions are supposed to be surrounded. We'll come to that shortly. But the reports today speak of the Russians having advanced westwards from those positions that they've captured and having completed the capture of the entirety of these streets, the two streets leading out of Krasnogorovka, in which case all of Krasnogorovka is finally under Russian control. The Russians control the whole of Krasnogorovka. And the Russians not only control, apparently, according to these reports, the whole of Krasnogorovka, but if you look again at a map, the Russians capture Ukrainsk and Girnik and Kurakhivka. They're already positioned in Krasnogorovka. Krasnogorovka is also very close to Kurakhivka. They can attack these two places, this place, from two directions, from the north and from the east, bringing them, as I said, to the Kurakhovo reservoir. And again, the Russians have been pushing towards Kurakhovo already. Some weeks ago, they captured the village of Georgievka, which is located west of Marinka. They've been fighting to push through to Kurakhovo from the village towards Kurakhovo through the village of Maximilianovka. They also control villages to the south off to the south, places like Novomykhailovka, Konstantinovka. Vuhledar itself is now at risk of capture, as we've seen. So one can see how the net around Kurakovo in the south is closing, and as that officer of the 47th Brigade of the Ukrainian army says, the Ukrainians have probably left it too late to conduct an organized withdrawal from this area. Now, to repeat again, all of these reports about large numbers of Ukrainian troops cut off in the area of the fields north of Krasnogorovka, west of Novoskoye, south of Karlovka and Pervomaisky and all of these places. Well, if there are Ukrainian troops there, they're probably now effectively surrounded. That is, of course, is assuming that the Russians do control all of Krasnogorovka, as the latest reports say. How many Ukrainian troops there really are on this territory, I find difficult to say. David Axe recently talked about elements of 4 brigades. It seems an astonishingly large number of troops to have in this area of empty fields. I've seen drone footage, by the way. It's typical flat steppe land. Very difficult to understand what the Ukrainians are doing there. But anyway, one way or the other, the point is that the Russians, whether there are Ukrainian troops trapped there or not, the Russians are going to occupy all of this territory very soon. They have the whole territory now basically in a circle. Once they occupy this territory, they will indeed, exactly as that report from TASS says, have straightened their front lines. They will have a solid front all the way from Ukrainsk to Girnik and Kurakovo itself. So that widens the whole area of Russian control, and it surely also means once all of this is resolved, which maybe will take 2 weeks, 3 weeks or so, once all of this is done, it will mean that Ukrainian positions in Kurakovo, Selidovo, and Vuhledar will become untenable. In the Vuhledar area, the 79th Brigade, which has been defending Novomykhailovka, Konstantinovka, it was recently pushed out of Konstantinovka. They're now apparently admitting on their website that the days of Vuhledar under Ukrainian control are numbered, that it is going to be impossible for the Ukrainians to hold these positions for very long. And of course, the Russians are close now to capturing Vuhledar. They're very close also to the village of Velika Novosilka, west of Vuhledar, that I've been talking about. One can start to see a large block of territory is about to pass under Russian control. And once all of that has happened, with the supply lines from Donetsk to Pokrovsk firmly under Russian control, the Russians will be in a position to launch their major offensive against Pokrovsk. And to go back to that TASS report, which, remember, it's the official Russian news agency, once everything has been resolved, later, and this is an exact quote, a wide front offensive on the key enemy hubs will follow. And identified amongst them are Vuhledar, Pokrovsk, and Mirnograd. Now, the Russians are clearly preparing for the for the attack of Pokrovsk, because they're now launching heavy missile and bomb attacks on Pokrovsk. They managed apparently to blow up, to destroy this bridge that they were attacking over the previous days. It looks as if Russian drones are already active on the supply roads. Russian drones have become much more long range and powerful. Lancet drones can certainly now reach the supply roads from Russian positions. So I'm not saying that Pokrovsk is sealed off by these drone attacks. Obviously not, at least not yet. But the supply position of the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk soon is going to start to get more difficult. The Ukrainians have sent such forces as they have to the Pokrovsk area. There are even some brave souls in Ukraine who are talking about a counteroffensive, a Ukrainian counteroffensive in this area. I think the Russians would be delighted if the Ukrainians did something like that. Apparently, they have superiority in numbers, though it's clear that their forces are not yet fully organized, but they do have superiority in numbers. They have superiority in artillery and armor, and of course they have their aviation, their aircraft with their fab bombs active. If the Ukrainians are foolish enough to launch an offensive, well, they might gain a little ground for a short time, but they would suffer disproportionate losses, and it will only end up assisting the fight, the battle for the Russians in Pokrovsk. It will make it easier, ultimately, for the Russians to capture Pokrovsk. Now, that's the situation on the battlefronts in Pokrovsk and in that area. The crucial battle of the war, the one which the Russians have planned most carefully. I suspect the preparations and the thinking about this battle preceded the capture of Avdiivka in February. We've still got a fair amount of way to go. We will see what the Russians do and what the Ukrainians try to do in response. But whatever it is that the Ukrainians are going to try to do, they will now know that for the moment at least, they're not getting the kind of assistance from the West that they perhaps hoped for. I'm going to suggest that from the Ukrainians, this is a much worse logistical crisis or equipment crisis or re-equipment crisis than the one they experienced over the course of the winter when Congress put a 6-month break on further appropriations of military supplies from the United States to Ukraine. The Ukrainians at that time had reasons to hope that that break would be lifted, which of course eventually it was. No such break, however, exists now, and yet we can see that the Ukrainians are seeing their supplies dwindle, and it's what we're looking at is what Brian Beletic especially has been talking about for months, years in fact, that we have finally reached the end point of what the West can continue to provide. Some weapons, obviously, will continue to be sent to Ukraine, but from now on, the supplies will fall to dribbles. Anyway, other things are going on in other places. There is film, really very difficult to understand film, which appears to show Russian troops operating on the West Bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. This is the territory that the Russians withdrew from in the autumn of 2022 when they retreated from Kherson city itself. General Surovikin, who was then the overall Russian commander, urged the withdrawal. The Russian General Staff apparently insisted on it. The withdrawal duly took place. The politicians apparently were unhappy, but they bowed to the insistence of the military on this issue. Well, anyway, there is film which shows Russian troops on the West Bank of the Dnieper. The Russians control now apparently all of the islands in the Dnieper. The Ukrainians captured many of these islands over the course of their disastrous offensive in Krinky, their bridgehead in Krinky. The Russians have now recaptured the islands, and they've now landed a force on the west bank of the Dnieper. The assumption, which I'm sure is correct, is that this is some kind of reconnaissance force. It's difficult to believe that the Russians at this time are planning some kind of major operation across the Dnieper, especially at a time like this, the autumn, when the Dnieper will be at its widest and the waters will be at the strongest, the currents will be at the strongest. As the autumn rains come, it seems an odd time to launch a cross-Dnieper operation. Having said that, there are reasons to think that the Ukrainians have pulled back most of their forces from the Dnieper. They're short of men right across the front lines. It could be that Kherson region, west of the Dnieper, is thinly defended by the Ukrainians at this time. And it's important always to remember that the Russian forces in Kherson region, the Russian group of forces in Kherson region, numbers 130,000 men, according to the Ukrainians. It's commanded by one of Russia's most capable generals, General Teplinsky, who is also the commander of Russia's airborne forces. These 130,000 men have been doing relatively little over the last few months. It may be that someone in Moscow thinks that now is the moment to start putting them to use. Maybe some sort of operation across the Dnieper to keep the Ukrainians occupied and to force them to divert forces from other fronts, from the Pokrovsk area, for example, might be in the works. I don't know. As I said many times, the Russian General Staff doesn't share its plans with me. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, further east in Donetsk, the Ukrainians apparently deployed or redeployed the 12th Azov Brigade. This is the same brigade that was previously surrounded in Mariupol, which hid under the Azovstal factory, that eventually surrendered en masse to the Russians. That was then, most of its men, not all of them, were then released by the Russians with all sorts of promises. In the case of the commanders from Turkey, that they would not be allowed, they would not be able to rejoin the Ukrainian army. Promises which the Turks, by the way, broke. But anyway, let's not revisit all of that. Anyway, this is an elite, highly motivated brigade. The Ukrainians have redeployed it from the area of Kremenaya forest, where this brigade has been conducting a completely pointless offensive against the Russians, which has achieved nothing. As I've discussed in the past, this all seems to have been essentially an exercise by the 12th of Azov Brigade in narrative construction, telling everybody what a successful and heroic brigade it was, how it could defeat the Russians single-handed, even as the Ukrainian forces elsewhere were falling back. Anyway, the Ukrainians redeployed it to Donetsk. They launched an attack towards New York. The purpose, supposedly, is to enable the Ukrainian forces who are trapped in the industrial zone to retreat to the central area of Donetsk, thereby, incidentally, abandoning the industrial area to the Russians. I suspect that this is all that this is. I cannot imagine that the Ukrainians really believe that they can recapture New York or achieve anything significant there. I suspect that the Russians in this area are much too strong. And I also suspect, by the way, that for the Russians, it might even have been something that they were not entirely averse to. There's been much discussion about cauldrons and those sort of things that the Russians are supposed to do. At the very start of the war, like many people, I assumed that Russian operations philosophy was all about creating cauldrons, surrounding large numbers of Ukrainian forces, forcing them to surrender, defeating the Ukrainian army in that way. This is based, by the way, on what happened in 2014 and 2015, when the Russians did, in fact, surround the Ukrainians in fighting in places like the Southern Cauldron, in Debaltseve, and other places like that. But, in fact, so far as I can tell, the Russians have never really worked to create cauldrons at any point in this conflict starting in February 2022. I think that the calculation that the Russians have is that the Ukrainian forces are simply too numerous, that trying to create cauldrons is too complex and expensive, costly of men and machines on the Russian side, and that it would pin the Russians, too many Russian soldiers down to try to control and contain these cauldrons. And if we're talking about New York, getting the Ukrainians to pull out of the industrial zone of New York, if that's what they intend to do, means that the Russians can occupy this territory in New York without obstruction. The same, by the way, applies to this so-called cauldron in Pokrovsk region, west of Novolskoye, north of Krasnogorovka, south of Karlovka and Perlomysk, in all of these places. Again, assuming that there are Ukrainian troops there, I suspect that the Russian calculus is that it'll make better sense for the Russians to simply allow these troops to retreat and withdraw so that the territory can be occupied by the Russians without cost, straightening, as they say, their front lines and releasing more Russian troops for other things, than to devote time and energy to try to encircle Ukrainian troops in a cauldron located there. As you will notice, my own understanding of the Russian way of war has evolved very substantially since I first started discussing this war when it began 2.5 years ago, when I was far less informed about things than I am now. Anyway, of course, it could be that the Ukrainians, in spite of what I've said, do have some wider plans to advance in New York, even as the Russians apparently continue their advance inside Donetsk itself. If they do that, they're piling more folly upon folly. All that it will do is that it will result in more defeats and more disasters for them, more losses that at this point of the war they simply cannot afford. And, well, there's been less news over the last 24 hours in Chasiv Yar and Siversk. I'm not going to, therefore, discuss what's going on those battlefields today, though I have no doubt that the Russians are continuing their advance in both places. Dima at the Military Summary Channel is saying that the Russians are conducting a major bombing and missile and artillery offensive of Ukrainian positions around Kupiansk, perhaps in preparation for an offensive. He says this is the heaviest shelling that the Russians are conducting anywhere on the front lines at the moment. He's probably right. It's all based, by the way, on satellite pictures of fire anomalies. I'm not going to try and second guess what that means. But suffice to say that in the area of Kursk, where the Ukrainians have their enclave, it's now very clear to me that the enclave is collapsing. Group of Forces North will say this. Fierce fighting continues in the north of Suj, to the north of Suja. We have made significant progress in the Malaya Lochnia area, having destroyed up to 30 Ukrainian troops. The enemy carried out 3 counterattacks and had no success and lost up to 20 people killed. There's also been significant advances in the direction of Snagast. We have pushed the enemy back 500 meters and are continuing to advance in the southern direction. The total advance of our troops in Kursk region amounted to more than 500 meters. Well, it doesn't sound like a dramatic advance, but the impression that this is giving is that the Russians are advancing right around the enclave, both from the west, from Korenovo, that's where Snagast is located, and from the north in the Malaya Lochnia area, and that the Ukrainians in Kursk region are being pushed back. They've also suffered massive losses in this area, over 10,000 men, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. This is killed and wounded. Group of Forces North say that they lost 320 men in the Kursk area in the last 24 hours. Again, important to stress, killed and wounded. They've also lost 13 HIMARS and M270 multiple launch rocket systems supplied by the United States and the European powers. The destruction of HIMARS and M270 systems in this area is a disaster for Ukraine. It's important to remember that these are also the launch vehicles for the ATACMS systems. So Ukraine has lost many of their launch vehicles for the ATACMS, which might explain why we're getting reports of fewer and fewer ATACMS strikes. I think the United States and the Western powers are becoming more reluctant to supply these launch vehicles, and that presumably might also explain why the United States is now switching to supplying limited numbers of the shorter range JSAMS missiles that I was talking about earlier in the program. So, overall, the situation in Kursk region has now definitely reversed. As Putin said, the Russians are step by step starting to squeeze the Ukrainians out. To repeat again, this is an unstable enclave. The Ukrainians never sorted out their logistic problems. Trying to defend themselves in it has resulted in huge losses, and they've never captured the positions that they needed to capture in order to fix the front lines. A Russian breakthrough to Suja, which is by no means impossible, could cause the sudden collapse of the entire enclave, resulting in very heavy losses for the Ukrainian troops, and perhaps for many of them to be cut off in Kursk region without hope of relief and resupply, so that the Russians can deal with them one by one, piecemeal. Now, having said all of this, there was a rather interesting discussion. It's not just appeared on the Military Summary channel, it's been discussed by various others that the Ukrainians are now again trying to surround the Russian forces in Malaya, Lochnia. It's now finally, I think, acknowledged by more and more people that Malaya, Lochnia, which many of the mapping projects have insisted on showing under Ukrainian control, is actually controlled by the Russians. Anyway, there's been claims that the Ukrainians are trying to create a cauldron around the Russian troops in Malaya, Lochnia. As it happens, that appears to have been true until about 10 days ago. I remember reading that a Russian force in Malaya, Lochnia, and in, I seem to remember it was either a school or a prison in that area, or hospital, but anyway, a big building there had indeed been cut off by the Ukrainians, but that the Russians were able to break through. Russian Marines from the 810th Brigade were able to break through and relieve them and to stabilize the situation there. Anyway, there is now again a narrative that the Ukrainians are surrounding the Russians in Malaya, Lochnia. I have no reason to think that this is so. Group of Forces North speaks about the situation in Malaya, Lochnia in a positive way. They're saying we have made significant progress in the Malaya, Lochnia area. So one doesn't get the sense that they're worried about the situation there. I think a lot of the assumptions about a Ukrainian encirclement of Malaya, Lochnia revolves around the belief that the Ukrainians control the three villages of Ruskoye Porechnoye and Cherkaskoye Porechnoye and Nechayev, all of which are located to the east of Malaya, Lochnia. However, Group of Forces North has always spoken of these three villages as being under Russian control. The Ukrainians have made many attempts to capture these villages, and that explains pictures that have appeared of Ukrainian troops and armoured vehicles in these villages. But it seems that the Russians have successfully repelled all of these attacks. If the Russians do control Nechayev, Ruskoye Porechnoye and Cherkaskoye Porechnoye, then not only is the Ukrainian enclave in Sudzha much smaller, in Kursk region, much smaller than most people still think, but there is no siege of the Russians in Malaya, Lochnia, and the Russians are positioned much closer to Sudzha itself than I think many people perhaps understand. And for the record, that for the moment is my own belief. Anyway, this is where I end my program today. As we see, the battles continue. I think they've still got some way to go in the Pokrovsk area. The Russians are talking about an all-out assault on Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, and the Ukrainians themselves, the 79th Brigade themselves, admit that the days of Vuhledar are coming. The Kursk offensive is now definitely going into reverse, and we have this curious event of the presence of the Russians west of the Dnieper in Kherson region, though nobody so far can say quite what that is all about. The most important fact, however, is that despite all of the statements of support that we still get from the West about Ukraine, the Ramstein meeting suggests that support from the West is starting is now definitely dwindling. No long-range strikes on Russia are being authorized for the moment. The Pentagon has put its foot down. There are apparently some Western advocates amongst within NATO for this plan, but the Pentagon has set its face for the moment strongly against it. And the West finally seems to have reached that point where it has started to acknowledge that it cannot keep up the level of supplies that Ukraine needs. As Putin said, there will be, over the next few weeks, as the situation on the front lines deteriorates, a sustained campaign by the Western powers to try to persuade Ukraine to begin some kind of diplomatic initiative, a peace drive, if you like, a peace offensive by Ukraine in place of all its other offensives, its military offensives that have gone wrong. Lloyd Austin acknowledged that the war will end in negotiations, though many American officials have said that, and what they've always meant by that is that the Russians would capitulate. Maybe he acknowledges this time that it'll be the Ukrainians that will have to make the big concessions. We shall see. The Russians, as I discussed in my program yesterday, far from keen, not keen at all on negotiations. This conflict still has a significant way to go. I think it will continue into 2025. My own view is that the Russians, even Putin, now expect a military solution. I was struck by the annoyed tone of Putin's words about peace negotiations at the Far Eastern Summit yesterday. That, I think, is the current state of the war. Anyway, more from me soon. This is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.